I never thought patience could be stretched so thin, not until I found myself standing behind her, pretending to organize the shelves while my chest thudded like it had a mind of its own. She didn't notice me at first, of course. That was her power, an effortless confidence that made the air around her hum without a sound. I had no right to be here, fumbling with stacks of worn novels and outdated manuals. Yet somehow I kept showing up, week after week, as if proximity alone would teach me something about her I couldn't quite name. She leaned over the counter, sorting receipts, hair catching the fluorescent light, and I thought for a brief, ridiculous second that maybe patience had limits I hadn't considered. There was a softness to her movement, a meticulousness that bordered on ritual, and I felt a kind of awe I couldn't place. I wanted to say something, anything, but my voice tangled itself in my throat. So I lingered in the aisle behind her, pretending to adjust the spines of books I wasn't actually touching. When she finally looked up, our eyes met for a fraction of a second. She didn't smile, not really, just a tilt of the head and the faintest quirk of her lips, like she had caught me off guard, or maybe she was humoring me. That pause, brief, electric, settled over me. My fingers twitched as if the air itself had charged them. I wondered, in that instant, how someone could command a room without raising a voice, without even trying. "Do you need anything?" she asked finally, voice calm, a little clipped, like she was testing the waters. "No. Just browsing," I muttered, hating how small and ridiculous it sounded. Her eyes flicked to the stack of repair manuals I was hovering near, and she raised an eyebrow. "For a hobby or research?" "Something like that," I said, realizing I was smiling too easily, my pulse doing its own thing. She didn't press further, just returned to her paperwork, but I caught the faint curl of amusement at the corner of her mouth. That alone should have been enough to make me leave quietly, but I stayed. I stayed and imagined reasons to linger, pretending to adjust the chair here, to dust a shelf there. Anything that kept me in her orbit, even if she barely noticed. Then, without warning, she reached over and handed me a pen I'd been eyeing for some time, her fingers brushing mine for less than a second. The touch was incidental, casual, but it sent a jolt through me I couldn't name. My chest tightened, and I felt the world shrink around that one, fleeting contact. She didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge it further, yet I couldn't stop thinking about it. I left the store that day with the pen tucked into my pocket, as if carrying it might somehow make sense of the tension between us. And all the way home, the memory of her hand, light, unassuming, confident, kept replaying in my mind. How could something so small feel like everything? I didn't know it yet, but that moment was a spark. Not romance, not yet. Just a whisper of possibility, an unspoken electricity I wasn't ready to name. And still, somehow, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I showed up again the next afternoon, though I told myself it was only to help her with the inventory. The repair manuals had multiplied overnight, sprawled across the counter like an accidental confession, and she had that same look of quiet command, as if the chaos existed to be tamed by her alone. She didn't greet me warmly, nothing overt, but there was a flicker in her eyes when she noticed me. It lasted a fraction of a second, like a candle fighting a draft, before she looked back down at the papers in front of her. I stayed near the corner of the counter, pretending to organize labels, while my mind cataloged her movements. The way her shoulders tensed when she lifted a heavy box, the subtle curve of her fingers as they brushed a smudge from the countertop, the tired pull under her eyes that she tried to hide behind her careful posture. "Do you want me to?" I began, then stopped. The words felt unnecessary. She was capable, always capable. I learned quickly that my help was more about proximity than actual usefulness. She sighed softly, almost inaudibly, when a stack of manuals slid too close to the edge. Her hands hovered over them, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she trusted herself to set them down without disaster. And for the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability that didn't belong to her usual composed facade. She pressed her lips together, blinked once, and then let the pile settle with a measured grace. "You always look like you're holding a storm back," I said quietly, surprising myself. Her head snapped up slightly, startled, Not by what I said, exactly, but by the audacity that anyone might notice. She didn't answer immediately. Her lips parted for a second, then closed, and she let out a short, tight laugh. Not warm, but not dismissive either. I felt the pull of it, like the room had shifted just enough for me to notice her, truly notice her, in a way no one else seemed to. She leaned back, rubbing one hand over her face, then paused mid-motion, caught by some inner conflict I couldn't name. That hesitation, so small, so fleeting, made me want to step closer, to ask the questions I didn't have the right to ask. But I stayed still, studying the faint lines of fatigue, the way her hair fell across her forehead, the small tremor of her fingers as she set another box down. For a moment, the silence between us felt weighted, alive. I could feel it in the way her gaze flicked to mine and away, the unspoken acknowledgement of an energy neither of us dared label. I wanted to reach out, but I didn't. Instead, I watched, and the tension hummed quietly in the air, electric and forbidden. She glanced up again, just long enough for our eyes to meet, and the world seemed to contract around that instant. Then, almost casually, she handed me another box, her fingers brushing mine again. Not a deliberate touch, too subtle for that, but enough to make me pause, breath caught halfway between curiosity and restraint. And as I carried the box across the floor, the warmth of her hand lingered longer than it had any right to. I realized I hadn't moved yet from the edge of wanting, from the pull of something I wasn't allowed to name. The storm hit just after 7. Rain hammered the windows of the little repair shop, and the fluorescent lights cast shadows that seemed to curl around her like they were afraid to touch her. I'd stayed late under the pretense of finishing some inventory, but really, I wanted to see her when the world outside was too loud for anything else. She was crouched by the counter, sorting tiny screws into labeled jars, her sleeves rolled up just enough for me to see the faint traces of work callus on her wrists. The shop smelled faintly of oil, paper, and rain, the kind of scent that clung to memory before words even formed. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. She didn't look up, but I could feel her presence, sharp and steady, pulling at some corner of me I didn't know existed. "You always work like the storm's just part of the scenery," I said softly, leaning against the shelf across from her. She paused, head tilted slightly, fingers hesitating over a tiny jar. "And you always manage to show up exactly when I don't have time for company," she said, her tone clipped, but not cold. I smiled, but it felt small, fragile. There was a charged pause after that, the kind that makes the air heavier than it should be. I shifted closer to help her with the jars, our hands brushing for a heartbeat, and I thought, just for a second, that maybe I could reach across this tiny gap and close the distance between us entirely. Then her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it and stiffened, fingers tightening around the device. The name flashing across the screen was familiar, and I felt a pang, jealousy, guilt, something I wasn't supposed to name, curl through me. She sighed, shook her head slightly, and silenced it without answering. I watched her for a long moment, the soft tremor in her hand, the faint crease of worry in her brow. Vulnerable, but contained. She had learned how to keep herself together better than anyone I'd ever met. "Everything okay?" I asked, though I already knew better than to expect an honest answer. "Fine," she said, voice quieter, almost lost under the storm. The room fell silent again, the only sound the rain tapping on the windows, echoing like a heartbeat we couldn't quite follow. I could have leaned closer, said something reckless, anything that would shatter the careful boundary she maintained. Instead, I stopped myself, hands frozen mid-motion, caught between desire and respect, between the pull of the moment and the weight of what I didn't know. Her gaze met mine briefly, a flicker of something unspoken passing through her eyes. I wanted to read it, wanted to reach for it, but the moment ended before it could ever fully exist. She moved slightly, stepping back, and the subtle electricity between us hung in the air, unfinished, unresolved. I left the shop that night with a lump in my throat, the taste of almost things lingering like smoke. And I couldn't stop thinking about how close we had been, how one small shift, one word, could have rewritten everything between us. The shop smelled faintly of rain and oil, the storm from the night before still lingering in every corner. The windows streaked with droplets that caught the dim light like fractured glass. I was stacking manuals near the counter when she finally spoke, and the words made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't anticipated. "What are we even doing?" Her voice was quiet, steady, but there was a tremor underneath it, a crack I hadn't seen before. I froze, unsure if I was allowed to answer, unsure if she wanted one. I shifted my weight, pretending to adjust a shelf, though my hands were shaking. I don't know," I admitted, because that was the truth. I didn't know. I hadn't dared to ask, hadn't dared to name it, and now it hung between us like smoke in the air. She didn't move. She didn't even look at me, just leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely, eyes on some imperceptible point in the distance. I watched the tension in her jaw, the slight furrow between her brows, the way her hands flexed against her sides. Everything about her screamed control, yet the question she had asked betrayed a fragility I rarely saw. "I keep thinking," she began, then stopped, lips parting slightly, then closing again. "No, that's not it." She ran a hand over her face, long fingers brushing her temple as if trying to erase the thought before it fully formed. I stepped closer, though not enough to touch, aware that distance had suddenly become both unbearable and necessary. "You don't have to figure it out right now," I said softly, though even my voice felt intrusive. Her eyes finally met mine, and the storm in them was subtle but undeniable. Not anger, not longing, something far more raw. Something that felt like seeing yourself reflected in a mirror you weren't ready to face. She swallowed, and I saw the flicker of vulnerability there, a crack in the armor she always wore. "Have you ever felt like you're standing in the middle of something you don't understand, but you can't walk away?" she whispered. The question wasn't rhetorical, but it didn't require an answer either. It hung in the air, heavy with everything we hadn't said, everything we hadn't dared to touch. I wanted to speak, to reassure, to claim, to deny, all at once, but the words dissolved in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, letting the silence between us do the talking. The silence was intimate in a way touch never could be. It was honest, unbearable, and sharp. She drew a slow breath, eyes glistening, and for a moment, she seemed on the verge of saying more. Then she shook her head, almost imperceptibly, and muttered, "I don't want to ruin this, whatever this is." And then, in the quiet that followed, she added something so vulnerable it felt like a punch to my chest. "I'm terrified I'm going to lose myself in you, even if I don't want to." The words lingered long after, settling into the corners of the room, and I realized I couldn't unhear them, couldn't unfeel them. And I knew, in that instant, that nothing would ever be the same. I was rearranging boxes near the back corner of the shop when she called me over, her voice low and careful, like she was guarding something fragile. I approached, noticing how her posture had shifted, slightly hunched, shoulders drawn in, not the confident stance I was used to. "Can I show you something?" she asked, almost too quietly. My pulse quickened, and I nodded. She dug through a drawer behind the counter and pulled out a small, worn photograph, edges curling, the kind of photo you handle gently because it carries more weight than it should. I leaned in, trying not to stare, though I couldn't stop my eyes from tracing the image. It was her, younger, smiling, a man beside her whose face carried familiarity I didn't recognize at first. She watched me carefully, as if reading every flicker in my expression. "That was a long time ago," she said, her voice faltering just enough for me to hear the undercurrent of something raw. "I thought I had it all figured out then. I lost him." Her eyes dropped to the floor, tracing a line on the worn tile, and for the first time, the wall she always kept up seemed less like armor and more like glass. I wanted to say something comforting, something that didn't sound hollow, but the words stuck in my throat. I only managed, "I can see why that hurts." She nodded, a small, tight movement, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. I studied her, noticing the way her fingers lingered on the photo, the faint quiver in her lips, the quiet sadness in her eyes, tiny, human details I couldn't unsee. I realized I had been seeing only the surface of her all this time, and suddenly, she felt impossibly deep, a landscape I wasn't sure I was allowed to explore. Sometimes, she murmured, still gazing at the photograph, I think about what would have happened if I'd stayed, if I hadn't let it slip away. Her voice cracked slightly, and I flinched as if I had been hit. I wanted to reach for her hand, to bridge the distance between us, but I didn't. Instead, I took a slow breath and said, softly, maybe, maybe some things aren't meant to be left behind. They stay with you, in ways that matter. Her gaze flicked up at me then, just for a second, and something passed between us. Not attraction, not yet, but an acknowledgement of shared fragility. My chest tightened, a hollow ache that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with the honesty in her voice. She tucked the photograph back into the drawer, but when she looked at me, I noticed the subtle shift in her expression, lighter, but trembling, as though sharing the weight had both relieved and scared her. You notice things, don't you? She asked, almost a whisper, almost a challenge, almost a confession. I shrugged, trying to appear casual, but my hands betrayed me, clenching slightly at my sides. Just try not to leave, she said, voice soft, eyes glistening. And in that single, almost ordinary moment, something seismic happened inside me. I realized I was no longer just observing her. I was tethered, quietly, irrevocably, to the parts of her she rarely showed anyone. The shop was nearly empty that evening, the hum of the fluorescent lights filling the spaces we didn't dare to speak in. I was stacking boxes near the window when she came out from behind the counter, carrying a small bundle of receipts and paperwork. For a moment, she just stood there, shoulders relaxed in a way I hadn't seen before, as if the storm inside her had finally loosened its grip. I swallowed, unsure if I should speak. Instead, I waited, letting the silence stretch. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, and I realized that was enough. Enough for acknowledgement, enough for presence, enough to admit what had been quietly growing between us without needing words. We moved through the shop side by side, arranging the last of the manuals together. There was a rhythm to it, quiet, shared, patient. I noticed the way her fingers brushed mine when we reached for the same book, the subtle warmth that lingered afterward. Not a gesture meant to claim, not a flourish of desire, just a recognition that we were here, together, and neither could deny the gravity between us anymore. You don't have to say anything, she murmured, voice low, almost lost in the hum of the lights. I'm not sure there's anything left to say, I replied, though my heart thumped louder than it should have. We continued in that shared silence, arranging, straightening, moving with a gentle synchronicity that felt like understanding without explanation. Every glance, every small adjustment of a book or box, carried a weight I didn't need her to articulate. I had spent weeks noticing her, the faint line of fatigue under her eyes, the tilt of her head when she was thinking, the way her lips curved in a private, half-smile, and now she seemed to notice me in the same way. At the end, we paused. I reached for a box. She reached at the same time, and our hands met, lingering longer than necessary. I didn't pull away. She didn't either. Just for a moment, the rest of the world receded, leaving only the quiet pulse of our connection. You always notice everything, she said softly. Almost a statement, almost a confession. I notice you, I whispered back, though it felt too small for what it meant. Her breath hitched, not in drama, not in need, but in recognition. She leaned just slightly toward me, forehead brushing against mine, and I felt the weight of everything. Past heartbreak, unspoken longing, weeks of near misses settled gently between us. No grand declarations, no fireworks, just the inevitability of what had quietly been building. We stayed like that, side by side, hands brushing, foreheads touching, letting the quiet speak for us. The shop, the boxes, the muted hum of lights, all of it faded into insignificance. All that mattered was this shared, earned space. Eventually, she straightened slightly, eyes meeting mine with the faintest flicker of a smile, a shared acknowledgement of what we both felt but didn't need to say. I realized then that this was it, this quiet, imperfect, human collapse into something real. And in that final, ordinary yet extraordinary moment, I knew, whatever this was, it was ours. And that was enough. It's been months since that evening in the shop, yet sometimes I still catch myself noticing the small things, the way her fingers linger on a book's spine, or how the light hits her hair, just so, like it's meant to be remembered. Life hasn't changed in grand, cinematic ways. There are still deadlines, boxes to move, and storms outside the windows, but everything feels quieter, fuller, somehow steadier. I think about her a lot, but not with the restless ache I used to carry. The tension that defined our first months, those near misses, the unspoken questions, the silence that felt too loud, has softened into something warmer, more honest. I've learned patience in a way I never expected, not the anxious, fumbling kind, but the kind that sits quietly next to someone you care about without trying to fix everything. And she's allowed herself to rest, even in small ways. I see her laugh more freely now, less guarded, and sometimes, just sometimes, I catch her glancing at me when she thinks I'm not watching. It's subtle, nothing dramatic, but it carries a weight that tells me she's changed, too. We still have our boundaries, our moments of hesitation, the awareness that life isn't always neat or fair. But there's also trust now, in ourselves and in each other. The love we've found isn't fiery or reckless. It's quiet, patient, real. It's in the shared space of a late-night shop, the gentle brush of a hand when passing a book, the small smiles over coffee when no one else is looking. Sometimes, I catch myself thinking back to the first spark, the pen she handed me, the fleeting brush of her fingers, the photograph she shared. I realize now that those little moments weren't just sparks. They were openings, invitations to see her fully, even when she didn't let anyone in. And somehow we did. Somehow we got here. I don't know what the future holds, and we never promised perfection. But I know this. I'm better for having watched her carefully, better for having lingered in her orbit, better for having allowed myself to feel fully, without pretense, without fear. And she's better too, in ways only she can know, because love, real love, sometimes doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it waits, quietly, until you recognize it in ordinary, human moments. And that's what I carry with me. The quiet certainty that even in our flawed, messy lives, some things are worth the patience, the hesitation, the unspoken. That's how we found each other. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?